See. Okay, apparently we are live. Just waiting. We've got a new system going here, so I'm not entirely certain things are going the way they're supposed to be. Let me just make sure that they are. And yeah, it looks like they are. So hello and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Happy to see the folks that are here. And for those of you who are new here, what's going to happen is I'm going to do a bit of a presentation that'll probably go for half hour, 45 minutes, sometimes as long as an hour. And at the end of that, I'll answer questions. I'll do Q&A for a while. The questions that you might ask while I'm doing the presentation, I'm not going to be able to pay attention to. Don't have that much mental bandwidth. So if you have particular questions, then ask them again at the end of the at the beginning of the Q&A period, so I can pay attention to that. You may notice if you're new here, there's a live chat. We encourage you to dive into the live chat, discuss things with one another. You can be as abusive as you want to me. But I would please ask that you not be abusive of the other people in the chat, especially today. We're going to be discussing some really contentious stuff. So beat up on me as much as you want. Do not beat up on the other people in the live chat. If you do, if I see that, I will block you. So today, the topic is what white supremacists and the GOP and the Democrats don't understand about America. We're going to dive into some pretty contentious stuff here. It's actually a topic I've been meaning to write about for years. I've got a number of sort of half-written scripts, but I couldn't quite figure out how to put it in a mode that sort of fitted my definitions of political correctness. So I think it's actually, to my mind, a little insane that I'm now going to do this live, where I can't choose my words carefully. But honestly, sort of the one of the two mass shootings this past weekend sort of convinced me that it was something that was worth discussing. And I think it's something that's really important because there's a lot of finger pointing and sort of blame casting going on, specifically over a manifesto that the El Paso shooter published that I would not encourage you to look at. It's actually nothing new. It's very similar to what the New Zealand shooter did. And it is, I think this is a little overblown, but I think it's fair to say it's also very similar to a lot of ideology that is pushed by right-leaning figures. Steve King of Iowa is a really obvious one. Also, our president, Donald Trump, pushes that as well. But before the right-leaning people here bail out, I think there's actually a greater level of responsibility for those of you who've, sorry about the siren out there. I guess I'm not gonna wait for it to pass because it's still going. There's a broader level of responsibility than just saying, oh, it's the Republicans' fault, this kind of ideology, or oh, it's just Fox News' fault. Because the ideology that, oh, I got a super chat. Thank you, Ruben Garcia. The ideology that sort of underpins the mass shooting, like fundamentally, isn't just an ideology that's held by Republicans or right-leaning people or by white nationalists or racists. It's actually an ideology that is supported and really a specific idea, not an ideology, that is supported on all spectrums of the US political world. Right, left, everywhere. It's something that's just sort of assumed that's going to happen. So let's talk very briefly about the mass shootings this past weekend. Disgusting, horrible stuff. I really don't like talking about the shooters. I do believe that they do this mostly for notoriety, mostly to get known. However, at a certain point, when you get to a certain volume of terrorist acts that are the responsibility of a particular ideology, you do have to address the ideology. And it is, obviously there's different threads, different streams, different things that come into this. You can call it alt-right, you can call it You can call it many, many things, but at root, it's a sort of idea of white nationalism and white supremacy, specifically the idea of white genocide. It's this idea that white people in the United States are being replaced by brown people from everywhere. Mostly, the idea focuses on Latinos or Hispanics, and those were the victims in El Paso, largely. I think 20 odd people were killed, most of whom were specifically targeted because they were perceived to be Latino or Hispanic. So there's this ideology, and that sort of white genocide, white replacement theory is pushed really, really hard in certain realms online. It's also got a huge history, just in the United States since the 1960s. It's been that was sort of one of the big streams of reaction to sort of the perception of the country moving more left, was this sort of white nationalism, this approach. Goes back a long way. The guy who blew up Oklahoma City, I'm not going to use his name either, but it's a very famous name. This is back in the 90s. It was a guy who blew up a government building in Oklahoma City in the United States. It was tremendous. It actually was a great blow to the sort of militia movement in the United States of sort of white nationalists who'd go off into the woods and pretend to be in military forces. That sort of ended that movement because this guy was a part of that movement, and he was inspired by a book called The Turner Diaries, which talked about the coming race war and how all the white people were going to be replaced. So this is, there's levels to this, and I don't want with this video to let Donald Trump off the hook. I certainly don't want to let 8chan. I'm not too familiar with it. Whenever I see people in the mainstream media demonizing the internet, I'm tremendously suspicious. This idea that fake news or internet fake news is horrible and made bad things happen. I'm incredibly suspicious because there's a lot of fake news from established media organizations as well. So I'm usually very suspicious. However, I think it's quite clear. We've now got, I think, 2 or 3 mass shooters that have specifically gone to a particular internet forum called 8chan to publicize and have their murders celebrated. So it's clear that, yes, there absolutely is a particular internet-based subculture that deserves a lot of blame for these killings, is something that we should look at. At a broader level, yes, absolutely. Piss some people off saying is Donald Trump for sure deserves some responsibility for this. I mean, he's using this exact language that shows up in these manifestos of these mass killers. He's putting forward this this replacement ideology, this like insane white nationalist ideas. They are something that Donald Trump and Fox News plays with, and plays with liberally. But there is, and I do not want to let them off the hook. They absolutely bear responsibility for this. However, I think there's a broader responsibility that goes to all of us, and I think there's actually a critique that people on the right can come out that I think they can fairly say, not because it's true, but because of the way that the country as a whole and the political realm as a whole looks at a certain issue. I think that folks who want to defend Trump or Fox News for talking about white replacement or white genocide or whatnot, folks who want to defend them might say, wait a second, we can't talk about this. This is something that's happening. The United States used to be a much whiter country. Now it's not as white a country. Why can't we talk about this? What is this political correctness insanity? You're using the murder of these poor people to try to keep us from talking about something that's real and important. And actually, I think that is an interesting and worthwhile argument that supporters of Trump or Fox News might make, because they accurately see, or rather inaccurately see, a larger myth that the entire US political world believes in that's simply not true. And the white supremacist Donald Trump, the Democratic Party, right-wingers, left-wingers are united in believing in this central bullshit myth. And it's this central bullshit myth that motivates mass killers. I mean, not as much as 8chan does, not as much as Donald Trump does, but it is sort of this sinister underpinning that we're all complicit in, that that supports these white nationalists. And it's the idea that by 2045 or 2050, the United States is going to be a majority minority country. Now, if I say that, the United States is going to be a majority minority country, anybody who's probably most of the people here, anybody who anybody who reads the news and knows things in the United States is going to go, yeah, of course, that's a fact. I mean, that's what the U.S. Census says. I'm here to tell you today that that is not a fact. That is, there are just layers and layers of bullshit around that idea that the United States is going to be majority minority by the middle of this century that I think really need to be unpacked. Before I start diving into the details here, I want to say that there's two things. Like, one, I have like a two-part critique of this. One is that is sort of, maybe you could look at it as sort of a kumbaya sort of, lefty progressive, which is to sort of say that these categories that the U.S. Census uses are bullshit, and racial categories, all these racial categories are just a social mental construct, blah, blah, blah. So that may sound like namby-pamby, progressive, blah, blah, but I fully believe that to be the truth. And I'm going to make a case for that coming up. But also beyond that, that's one part of my critique. The other part of my critique is that even granting all of the racist assumptions that go into a census where you tick off the boxes that say Hispanic, white, Asian, what have you, even granting all of those assumptions, throwing out all the kumbaya progressive bullshit, the idea that, we're going to be majority minority by 2050 is just bullshit. So there's two parts to that. There's my sort of, namby-pamby progressive stuff, and then granting all the racist assumptions of the U.S. Census, it's also wrong. So that's what I'm going to be talking about here. So I would like to apologize before I get into this. This is some stuff that's kind of, it's racially charged. It's kind of offensive. But it's one of the reasons I have failed to write good scripts on this for years now. And it's kind of insane that I'm doing it live. But here I am. I guess you can call that a trigger warning or what have you. So the U.S. Census, the reason that people think that we're going to be majority minority, that the United States is going to be majority minority by the 2040s, is because of a series of categories set up by the U.S. Census and projections that the U.S. Census does. This isn't some, this isn't some right-wing or left-wing think tank that says that that the country is going to be majority minority by 2050. No, this is the U.S. government. This is the statistical agency. I'm embarrassed. The U.S. Census is, I believe, its own agency. It's probably under the Department of Agriculture. I don't know. It's under a larger agency or department of the U.S. government. But every 10 years, it's in the Constitution. The U.S. government counts everybody in the country. And the agency behind the U.S. Census just plays with the numbers. It's a tremendously important institution, the U.S. Census, and the agency that governs it. It's how we know most of what we know about the United States, and it makes projections. It puts together projections of what the composition of the United States is going to be. And the main, you guys may have noticed there's in the description to this video, I've put a link to an article by the Brookings Institution. The Brookings Institution is a very well-regarded think tank. It's one of the sort of oldest and grandest think tanks. Right-wing people will tell you that it's super left-wing. I will tell you that it's super pro-war, but it's still a pretty respected place. In 2018, they put together an article talking about the most recent census projections. I'd suggest, going down the description, clicking and opening and looking at that article, because we're going to go along with that. Specifically, there's figure 1 in the middle of that article. And here you see the categories that the census puts together. And what's interesting is that these categories have shifted over the years. And what's interesting, and this is getting into my sort of hippy-dippy, namby-pamby critique, but also getting into a very real-world critique as well, is that all of these categories are sort of weird and racist in their own ways. But I would argue, I mean, like, you know, the Black, sort of African American, famously that's actually probably one of the most clear-cut rules, because we actually have, you know, one of the most racist, you know, definitions. It's essentially they call it the one drop rule. It's like if you have one drop of African American blood, you are considered to be Black. So that category is actually pretty awful, but makes sense. Also, to be clear, these are all self-reported. These are definitions that people give themselves, which will become important later on. But I mean, Black, I think in US society, we know what Black is. That's slipping as well as we have more and more sort of mixed race, multiracial, I think is a better term, more and more multiracial people. And also as African Americans are finally in larger numbers able to sort of break down the legacies of slavery, Jim Crow, and what have you, and sort of move more into the mainstream. Now that's also difficult. But so Black is, you know, we know what Black is. Asian is pretty ridiculous as well, but you know, it's sort of a category that includes people descended from countries ranging from, you know, India to Japan. You know what that means. So what I think I'm focusing on mostly today, you know, this is a racial profile of the US population 2045, is the second most bullshit category here, which is Hispanic, and the most bullshit category here, which is white. Hispanic is interesting. Damn it, I had that. But I mean, it's a 20th century invention. There was actually a point, I think, in one of the early censuses in the 20th century where Mexican was its own category. And the origination of Hispanic as a category, I don't want to, you know, it now has, you know, Hispanic or Latino now has a great legacy of, you know, dignity and positive political movement and cultural movement and real identity and power. But basically Hispanic came around because there were some bureaucrats in the early 20th century or mid 20th century in Washington, D.C., white guys who decided, well, yeah, you know, they're kind of white people, but they're kind of not. You know, they're not white enough, you know what I mean, or what have you. And that was sort of the birth of this Hispanic category. And it's always been quite amorphous and weird thing because it includes a vast range of people. There's sort of more stereotypical visions that, you know, like the El Paso shooter might have had in his head, you know, more indigenous looking people. But the only through line between Hispanic is sort of an affinity for certain countries. And that can be African Americans, that can be, you know, people who fit under the amorphous and ridiculous, most ridiculous definition in the United States of white. So like for your given Hispanic can be somebody who had a Portuguese great grandfather, or it could be someone who just came up from an agricultural past in Mexico or Honduras. It's this tremendously wide range. And you can even see, and this is where this stuff begins to fail under its own weight, like even if we're talking sort of namby-pamby, even if we're granting the sort of racist assumptions, it begins to fall under its own weight when you look at these asterisks here next to white and Black. So the idea that in 2045, you know, white people are going to be under 50% finally in 2045. This idea relies on the idea that there's a whole section of white people that fit under, and once again, this is granting those racist assumptions of the census, that fit under the definition of Hispanic. And they simply don't. You know, while I don't know exactly what the chunk is here, I don't think there's really been adequate surveying and statistical work on like of that 25%. Once again, this is just a projection of a future that will never happen. What percentage of that 24% are folks who maintain a Latino identity on the basis of a Spanish great grandfather because it's useful for employment purposes or access to education, that sort of thing. So that's kind of, I mean, it's just freaking, it doesn't mean anything. And that's a real problem. The real motivation behind the idea of, okay, this is where we get really problematic, but there's been a tremendous push behind Latino, Hispanic, what have you, identity, and it's had a lot of political power and weight over the past 30 years because of mass migration. And it's a mass migration that is over. It's not happening anymore. I've covered that multiple times on this channel. There was in the 90s and early aughts this incredible push of folks coming from Mexico. That's over. Mexico is now rich enough and not reproducing at a level high enough to do mass migration in the United States anymore. That's over. We currently have a lot of problems in Central America, but if you look at sort of economic projections for Central America, I mean, provided everything doesn't get fucked up completely, things are actually trending up there as well. And the horror we see at the border is very likely to be sort of the last push, the last real push towards this sort of Hispanic Latino identity becoming a huge thing. And I'm not saying that, it isn't important or valuable or an incredible part of our multicultural, mix. I'm just saying that it's going to fade. And, not necessarily, it's not going to fade more quickly than Italian American or German American identities, but it's going to fade exactly the same way. There's a tremendous amount of energy put in, not just on the right, but also on the left, into this idea that there's something distinct and different and new about Latino identity in the United States, and that's deeply foolish, completely ahistorical. Folks, Spanish-speaking folks have been in the United States since its founding, and their descendants, just are kind of generic white people. And that's what's going to happen. Not by 2045, but it's going to happen more and more. The interesting thing about these projections, and if you read this Brookings article, is that they say they've already shifted over 4 years. This period where it's supposed to become majority minority has already moved out. A year or two. Their projections of when the United States will reach a population of 400 million, I think we're about 325 million now, has moved out from 2050 to 2060 or thereabouts. These are projections, and they're based on a sort of political mindset that won't exist. Won't exist next year. That's constantly changing. Another really important aspect of this that I think is the reason that these projections are slipping and slowly moving further and further into the future is that you decide what your definition is here. And every 10 years, and I think there are figures published on this, something along the lines of 1 million people decide to be white. Just fine. I guess I'll just do that. Because for whatever reason, in their own, self-conception, they've drifted away from thinking of themselves as Hispanic or Black or Asian, and now think of themselves as white. I'm not actually like a huge fan of that. Like, I really like the idea of moving on to a sort of post racial conception of American identity, like we are Americans, and I think that's actually already true. which is, I think, what I'm trying to say in this thing, because I've now dived in on the terms that the census puts out here, but these are ridiculous, and they're useful, and they should continue to be collected. And it's important. It tells us more about the country. But the idea of the most important of these sort of racial categories being the most important aspect of a U.S. voter, U.S. participant in society is, I think, pretty horrific and stupid. But it's at the root of both the Republican and Democratic parties' sort of self-conceptions at this point, which I think is really sad. And I think that people spend way too much time invested in this idea. So I think I've talked a little bit about why I don't really believe these projections, and I think they sort of fail under their own merit. And I think I've probably said some uncomfortable things about sort of Latino or Hispanic identity, and I apologize for that, but I think they're true things that need to be said. I think now it's time to sort of move on to this whole idea of white people, which is kind of ridiculous. And I think that comes into this idea of time. I think that's the most important thing that everybody from CNN to Brookings to Fox News to Donald Trump to everybody who pushes this sort of idea is that they're this idea of a majority minority future is that they're projecting their ideas based on today's politics and whatnot far, far into the future, and not reckoning with the changes that time can bring. Yeah, I mean, I just said DSM 0305 just asks, what defines a white person? And that is a fantastic question. In the United States, unfortunately, there's a tremendous legacy that I'm not going to dive into very much about defining a white person versus a black person. And the whole point of that, obviously, was so that the rich people in society could keep most of the poor workers in society on their side by saying, oh yeah, you're well below us, you're obviously below us, but you're still better than the black people. You're still better than the slaves and after they were freed. I mean, that's sort of the definition of white person in the United States. There's all kinds of other, things like, Western civilization, or just these insane. What's funny is that any real definition of a white person that's pushed by, say, your Ben Shapiro's or Donald Trump's or whoever the dipshit in Iowa is that they quickly fall apart under any kind of scrutiny. This idea of Western civilization. So how in God's name are Mexicans, Central and South Americans, how are they not a product of Western civilization? They're all freaking Catholic. I mean, or those that haven't switched over to a more, sort of United States style insane Protestantism. They speak Spanish. That's pretty gosh darn Western civilization. So yeah, I mean, there's all these ridiculous mental infrastructures sort of created around making white people somehow different from South American people, and it's all frankly quite ridiculous. What mattered, so talking about this sort of time and the way things have shifted, this idea of white America, in being special and different and distinct, and something that has to be protected is a very, very 20th century idea. Because, folks, unfortunately, almost certainly, my grandparents weren't worried about, not my grandparents, my great-grandparents, my great-great-grandparents weren't worried about, actually, they were worried about Chinese immigration, but they weren't worried about Mexicans so much, and they weren't worried about Africans or any other kind. What they really were worried about were the Italians and the Jews and the Slavs. My great-great-grandparents would have been really, really angry that the United States was losing its old Protestant English character to these awful, awful Catholics and Jews from Eastern Europe. And that was the definition of what American was. That was what mattered, around about 100, 120 years ago. And actually, there were laws. There were laws put in place in the 1920s to make sure that fewer Catholics and Jews and Eastern Europeans came in the 1920s. I mean, it was very seriously what the United States was worried about. You go like 50, 60 years before that. I mean, there was a whole party, Gangs of New York, a Martin Scorsese film from the like the 19. Oh, no, it was 2004, 5, something like that, is great. I mean, it focuses on the 1850s, 1860s, when you had a lot of people, especially after the 1840s, the Great Famine in Ireland. You had a lot of people in the United States being like, God damn, these Irish people are swamping us. They're going to take us over. They're going to, they're going to destroy, the country. It was the Irish people that they were focused on. And what's always happened in U.S. history, and I think someone had just pointed out in the comments that racism will always exist. Absolutely true. Racism will always exist. After, and I think you can already see. I think I did a video about this. About the terrible threat of Chinese grad students. You can already see in the United States the focus is shifting from Latinos. I mean, there's dipshits with assault weapons who don't get the memo, obviously, or dipshits in the White House who don't get the memo. But as Latino migration has fallen dramatically, people are drifting away from focusing on Latinos, and they're drifting away from focusing on Muslims as more and more people just looking at the facts and being like, oh, wait, the problem with the Middle East isn't Muslims, it's the United States. That's sort of drifting away. And yeah, it'll take 5, 10 years, and people are now focusing more on Chinese and Indian migrants. That's, the tale as old as time. It'll keep on going forever. But what the United States has managed that very few other places have is that we move on. Sadly, we move on to the next group to hate, and the people we used to hate are now part of the thing. It's really been fascinating watching the contortions of political figures who manage to be both, supposedly profoundly pro-Jewish and really worried about anti-Semitism, but at the same time really interested in demonizing migrants. And who knows? Like 20 years from now, you might have, people putting together, being really angry about what the Chinese are. Actually, shit, you've already got it. Really angry what the Chinese are doing to our Muslim brothers, our fellow American Muslim brothers, or rather their cousins in Xinjiang, it's something that always happens, but I don't think there's enough of a acknowledgement of how that's going to shift and how that's going to shift this idea of what's a minority and what's a majority. By 2045, and once again, according to the census, that number is already getting further and further out there. So by 2045, we're going to have a completely different conception of what all this means, just as we have a completely different conception of what a good American is from 1920 or 1860 or the time before that. So it just keeps on shifting. Now, I do actually think that there is an annoying sort of alliance between political parties that might make this particular system of prejudice and idiocy last a little bit longer, and might help the idea of sort of whiteness or whatever as it's currently defined last a little bit longer. And that's the thing. I've been alluding to this throughout the presentation thus far, and I think it's really important to emphasize this, is that this is not this idea of the model, it's a different idea. This idea of the majority-minority future is something that is pushed not just by Republicans, but also by Democrats. So with the Republican Party, we all know the way that the Republicans use this. It's for fear. It's, Republican politicians talking about, oh, there's too many of their babies and not enough of our babies. Fox News, Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham, and, other Fox News commentators to smaller extents. They really, just love this. And this is, Fox News is there to sort of terrify old white people, and that's what it does. This is one of the main things, and this is something that they really love gravitating towards. That's why they love this idea. But the Democrats love this idea too. They're not as loud about it. They're not as, but it's also a serious part of their self-conception and their political thought. It's this emerging Democratic majority. This idea that we're gonna get they believe. There's a lot of Democrats who believe these are I don't think this comes from any official. Actually, I could probably find it if I looked through more official communications, but on conversations with friends I know who are left-leaning and more democratic, they really do believe this exact white replacement, white genocide theory that motivated the El Paso shooter. They really think like, oh gosh, I really hope we can get enough immigrants in here, or that the country's going to change quickly enough that we can stop listening to these white yahoos and we can finally get to that emerging Democratic majority that we deserve. And that's a fucking myth too. I mean, that's just not the way things are actually going to happen. And I think it's pernicious that both the Republicans and the Democrats, for their own ideas, for their own reasons, are pushing this idea of sort of white replacement, white genocide, this, that, and the other thing. And I think the fact that neither side is at all interested in challenging this myth might mean that it lasts a little bit longer, and that's sad. So I think that's why it's important for folks to do like what I'm doing right now and try to attack this idea of the majority-minority future, because it's simply not true. Another way to indicate just how not true this is that it's continued to fail to materialize. For the Democrats specifically. Now, there are sort of outliers. I mean, there are places where at this point, because of this particular circa 2005 to 2025 political sort of Weltanschauung, sort of political set that we have, political mindset, political realities that we have, like, yeah, there are, California you can argue that Latino migration has been an important part of California's becoming so blue. It is not as important as people say, but it is an aspect of why Texas will be turning blue within the next 2 or 3 election cycles. But that's because those particular places have a real, like, massive concentration. That's the reason why you can see in the 19th century, most of the East Coast cities really did become Irish and Italian controlled, because that's sort of, the landing place, the ground zero for a particular immigrant community. That does happen. But as far as that happening throughout the entire country, it's just not happening, and it's simply not possible. And what's really fascinating is the way that it just keeps not happening. The degree of Latino support for Hispanic support for Republicans has, up until 2016, this is a very key point, up until 2016, constantly mystified, actually including 2016, which is pretty crazy, mystified Democratic strategists. I thought we deserved all the Latinos. I thought we were supposed to get all those Hispanic votes. I don't know. I don't have the exact percentages at my fingertips, but you can look it up. I think even after Donald Trump started his campaign talking about Mexican rapists, I think he still got 20%, well, 15 to 20% of the Latino vote in the United States. So this stuff is never as siloed as people want to portray it. And prior to 2016. Bush was always getting, 35, 37, 40, 40% of the Hispanic vote. I don't know what Romney's numbers were. And I do think that those numbers are going to be worse for Trump in 2020, but that's not because of his racist attacks on immigrants. There are tons of Latinos or Hispanics in the United States who feel resentment towards folks who are here illegally. I don't know what it is. I mean, when I say tons, I'm thinking maybe 15, 20, 30%, who knows? But I do believe that Hispanics will be turning against Trump in 2020, not because of some solidarity with Latinos or Mexicans or that sort of thing, but because of the threats that he's made to Texas prosperity by going after NAFTA. And that's not just Hispanics in Texas that are going to be angry about that. That's everybody in Texas that's going to be angry about that. So I'm sort of losing the thread here a bit. But yeah, so what's crazy about Trump is that, and this is what I'm talking about with people on both sides leaning into this framework, this idea of the majority minority future, where this is actually from the manifesto of the El Paso shooter, that we're about to become a one-party democratic state because of all the Mexicans. What's insane that the Republican Party has done under Trump is that they're going to fail at this, but they're working to make that true. It's crazy because very clearly after Romney lost to Obama, I mean, there were plenty of Republican research papers going out being like, look, like, we need to do a better job of appealing to minorities and young people and women and this, that, and the other thing. And then Trump came in and just sort of pissed on all of it, sort of set it all on fire. So it's this weird self-fulfilling prophecy where, because some of the dumber people in the Republican Party believed that they were about to lose something, that believed that they were the white people party, they're slowly turning themselves into the white people party. But it's not just, it's not an all white people party, and it never will be. Anyway, I think that's mostly what I have for this presentation. I hope that I made my points. Anyway, this idea that the future of the United States is majority minority just doesn't make any sense to me, because the categories put forth by the census don't make any sense. The assumptions that the census is making don't make any sense. As you can tell just by looking at a couple of years worth of the census's own projections, they just don't work that way. The assumptions that the Republican Party makes about what a Hispanic or a Latino is and what their political presumptions are going to be are wrong. The assumptions that the Democratic Party makes about what any ethnic group is going to do or not do is wrong. Those assumptions are wrong. And we're Americans, damn it. It would be nice if people focus more on that than sort of myths about a future that's never going to come. So yeah, that's what I have to say on that. And it did it in just 45 minutes. So have we got questions? Logo Cool Extreme asks, will you say that Trump has blood on his hands? That's a very dramatic way of putting it. Yeah, sure. Of course, every president has blood on their hands. Is Trump specifically responsible for the wave of white supremacist shootings over the course of his administration? Yeah, I'd say probably. Yeah, because there's that chain where, Trump has made this a priority. So Fox News has made this, white replacement, white genocide bullshit a priority. And that just sort of stems out into this whole network of shit, and eventually ended up polluting the minds of, 5 to 10 lunatics. Also, I mean, like, would these assholes have found some other reason to go shoot people? Yeah, probably. But the fact that they chose the targets they chose, it was interesting because this past weekend we saw like sort of two very different models of mass shooter. You had a very sort of in Dayton, Ohio, you had a very sort of, for lack of a better word, sort of Obama or Bush era mass shooter, just some whiny motherfucker who killed his sister and his sister's boyfriend and everybody else at the bar. This your classic sort of kill everybody who was mean to me in high school shooter. And then you had this massively politically motivated shooter who found another ideology that that in El Paso that justified his evil. And I feel like things wouldn't be happening at exactly at this pace. There wouldn't be this many mass shooters if, you know, a major political movement and a president hadn't, you know, given a seal of approval for this kind of ideology. So I think you can go a little too far with the blood on his hands. Like, you know, is Trump like directly culpable for what this fucking psycho did? No, but I do think that he absolutely is responsible for putting this sort of sick ideology out there and sort of invigorating this whole ideology and approach to things, for sure. Inquisitive asks, I got a question. Why don't you talk about a ban on assault rifles? You know, I'm a traditional supporter of gun rights. I don't like the government. I like the idea of an armed populace. That's a little shakier than it used to be, but it's not about mass shootings, actually. It's more about suicide. Most gun owners are vastly more likely to kill themselves than they are anybody else. And that's really what bothers me more about these guns than mass shootings, because statistically it's, I mean, many, many more people. And it's pretty horrifying. I do have a video on sort of how my thoughts on gun control have been evolving that I'm workshopping, and maybe it'll be out by the end of the year. But yeah, I'm not a big gun control guy. I've always been a big Second Amendment guy. So yeah, that's probably why I don't talk about a ban on assault rifles. That said, you know, I'm a big Second Amendment guy, but you know, if people want to amend the Constitution or people want to do rules that you know rein in guns, I'm not, you know, against that. I think that a lot of the sort of jurisprudence around the Second Amendment is super politically motivated, and this idea that like fucking stand your ground laws, where you can basically like start a fight with somebody on the street and then shoot them, but you know you're standing your ground, so it's okay. Or open carry, like this fucking ridiculousness. Like you can walk with an assault weapon into a Starbucks, like, and it's fine. I fucking hate that shit. I fucking hate the NRA. I think it's ridiculous that the CDC isn't allowed to investigate gun deaths in the United States. That's absurd. But you know, all that said, I am not against the Second Amendment. I think that, you know, the public should have the right to bear arms. So yeah. Questions. Did anybody, let's see. So I think there was a super chat. Did anybody notice, was there another, did somebody with the super chat ask a question? If you did a super chat and you asked a question, please do ask another question. But anyway, all right, I'm going to go to these questions. Let's see. Someone had asked a question like, why do you think it's ideology rather than lack of sexual success that led these people to do these things? I think that's just fucking stupid. I know people are weak and fallible and stupid, but you know, I don't have a ton of sexual success. I don't, you know, run around with assault weapons and kill people. That's fucking brain rot. Ideologies can absolutely give sick people the freedom to act in sick ways and to do evil things. I mean, it's this idea? Oh, it's video games, or oh, it's, you know, some kind of men's rights bullshit that makes these people kill. So is that the way you feel about the 9/11 people? Is that the way you feel about the San Bernardino shooter, or the Pulse nightclub shooter? You know, the people who in ISIS, are they just really just sort of sexually frustrated losers? The idea that that we're supposed to have this massive fucking war on terror, but we can't talk about how, you know, the president's words might have contributed to some death. I just find that particularly silly. All right. What kind of question? Inquisitive is a follow-up said, I didn't ask about all guns. Why do you need assault rifles? You can keep your hunting rifles and handguns. I mean, honestly, because of my general position on the Second Amendment, I just don't really know much or care about the assault rifle, assault weapons ban, this, that, and the other thing. So, yeah. Questions, questions, questions. Ruben Garcia. Well, thank you for the super chat. That was very great. I'm very grateful. So with the super chat, basically, you guys can contribute as I'm talking, which makes me very happy. I'm very grateful. Questions. Cool Extreme asks, is the United States the Saudi Arabia of white supremacy? That's actually a really interesting question, Logo Cool Extreme. I think white supremacy is a more broad-based ideology. The fucked up thing about Saudi Arabia is that it was so rich for so long, while most of the Muslim world was so poor. So it was able to pour, the literally over $1 trillion that it has poured into pushing that Saudi Arabia has poured into pushing a sick version of Islam over the past 50 years was tremendously more powerful. Like if the United States poured $1 trillion into white supremacy over the past 50 years, it wouldn't be as powerful as Saudi Arabia's, Islam of hate has been over the past 50 years, because Europe was not as poor as the rest of the Muslim world was. Did I make that analogy clear? Like, whereas Saudi Arabia said, okay, this is how you do Islam crazy. And, they went to North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. It's hard to remember, but, 20, 30 years from now, Indonesia, Malaysia, these Muslim countries in Asia were tremendously poor places. So that had a lot more power than sort of the United States forcing an ideology on, say, France or the United Kingdom or even Eastern Europe, which was always poorer, but nowhere near as poor. So, yeah, I don't think it's exactly fair to say that I don't think it's a great analogy saying that the U.S. is the Saudi Arabia of white supremacy, but it is an interesting idea. White supremacy is an idea, or just sort of racism generally, is a many-splendored idea that reverberates around Europe, around the world, around the United States. So, well, we've certainly, we're the United States, we take leadership in many things, but I don't think that's fair to say that we're the Saudi Arabia. Well, that's interesting. Connor Patterson asks, can you give my buddy Robert from Ram Ranch a shout out? Much love. That's not sure what that means. But Shivansh N.A. asks, do you think nationalism is good if it destroys supremacist and casteist assholes? That's a very interesting question. I'm assuming that you're talking about specifically the questions in India. And that is interesting. Sort of nationalism has had a history of fucking up a lot of assholes. I think nationalism was tremendously important in European history and sort of moving from an aristocratic way of governing the country to one that was countries to one that was more focused on the people. Nationalism is it's kind of like religion in a way, in that like it can be used for an incredible range of purposes, both horrifically evil and also positive. I think there's a lot of people who say that the main problem with many African countries is that there is not enough of a unified sense of nationalism, for those particular countries. One of the reasons that Iraq has been so durable after a really horrific 20, 30, 40 years is that there actually is a sense of Iraqi nationalism that has developed there, that has managed to keep it together and surviving after after the abuses of Saddam Hussein, both Bush's, Clinton, and United States occupation. So nationalism is a tremendously double-edged sword. As to how it's working in India specifically, that is kind of interesting. I don't know enough about the BJP and Modi to talk about, what their relationship is to the caste system in India, or perhaps you were thinking of the more from the Congress side, that sort of Congress would be able to use nationalism to try to defeat Hindutva. I can't say it. I'm sorry, but yeah, I mean it's very interesting. It's something I'm interested in reading about more. Fuma Aoki asks, what do you think of the media depicting Tulsi Gabbard as a Russian puppet or an Assad apologist after she criticized Kamala Harris's prosecutorial record in the second Democratic debate? I think that's a great question. I think Tulsi Gabbard is someone that I do think, now I am not a Tulsi supporter, not because she, went and saw Assad. I thought that was great. And I think a lot of her, I agree with a tremendous amount of her platform, and I think she gets a lot of unfair critiques because of her, basically for being pro-peace, because she is anti-war, because she is against regime change wars. She is loathed by most of the Democratic Party and certainly loathed by the official media in the United States. She is absolutely unfairly pilloried. And that's for damn sure. It's interesting. There's this whole genre of like gotcha questions. Like I think what they're like, is Assad a war criminal? Is Assad a war criminal? And she was just being like not wanting to play into that sort of bullshit frame. My answer to that would have been, was like, yes, Assad is a war criminal, and the United States created him through their insane policy of regime change wars. I do not support Tulsi Gabbard, though, because of something I saw in one of her promotional things where she was talking about the possibility of civil war in the United States. And I find that absolutely ridiculous and absolutely disqualifying for any national politician to even admit that that's a possibility, because it's not. And I think making an argument of why that's not a possibility and why that's ridiculous would be fine. But I think she said something about the Mueller thing helping to avert a civil war or something like that. I wish I'd held on to the clip, but I just remember watching that and just being like, whoa, yeah, fuck this shit. So it's a shame, because I think Tulsi Gabbard is talking about essential, really important stuff in the Democratic nomination process. And she is absolutely being unfairly demonized, but I do think that some of her rhetoric went to places that I find unacceptable. So. All right. Robert Fried points out that there's also a difference between civic nationalism, 19th century liberal movements in Europe, and racial nationalism, Nazism. And I would say, yes, there is, but not as much as you'd think. Nazism is absolutely an outgrowth of 19th century liberal nationalism. Before Nazism, it was just, liberalism and nationalism. They just sort of marched hand in hand. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but you could consider yourself a progressive radical and also be super into nationalism. The Soviets were super into nationalism in ways that ended up, breaking up the Soviet Union. So, and I think there's an instinct, not to pick on Robert Fried, but I think there's this instinct to be like, Nazism and that kind of nationalism is different and completely evil and wrong and good. And I agree, it's wrong and evil and but it's not so different from the ideologies that founded most of modern Europe's political systems. And I think I can understand the instinct to try to be like, put Nazism in the corner, it's evil and different. But I think, and it belongs in the, it is evil and different, but I think we're stronger and smarter if we admit to ourselves that all of our systems are vulnerable to going in that perverted way. So if we portray it as this crazy aberration, we tend to think like, oh, we'll never go there. But I think it's important to be conscious that crazy aberration was just a few base pairs, just a slight mutation of the systems that run most of the modern world today. So it's important to note that the Nazis are a cautionary tale, and they're not as far away from what we, our day-to-day as we like to think. Interesting. Shivan Chene says, in India, if I even say I put my case before nation, I may get beaten up. Well, I mean, I'm, generally against caste systems, sorry. But I can't speak to that. Thanks. Gorka Mosen says, question. Doesn't ask one. Okay, Ruben Garcia. Mexico is insanely bigoted against Central Americans, despite being, for the most part, the same race. Yeah, wow, that's grim, but also not very surprising. Ruben Garcia says, what do you think about it? I mean, yeah, it's, I think I've talked about before, while I absolutely am invested and angry about the legacy of the United States in Latin America, sort of imperialism and violence and nastiness, and not just the violence, just the the way that we've always acted in Latin America. There's a lot of folks in Latin America who make a lot of noise about U.S. racism, whereas Latin America is awash in racism. I mean, there's still a real deeply seated racial hierarchy to the way that all of the countries south of the border are organized. So it's not just about being bigoted against Central Americans. It's about racial hierarchies within Mexico, as someone who lives as a U.S. citizen, I live in a very glass house, but it's not as glass. So I don't want to throw stones, but it's not as glass a house as those political leaders in Latin America talking about U.S. racism living. It's a pretty, so yeah, that's sort of what I think about that. Mo Freedom, good-looking honky says, Mo Freedom, Peter North here, old adult film star. Question, Peter North, that's an old reference. Will we see civil war? Presumably, Peter North, was Peter North a U.S. or Canadian porn star? Whatever. He, presumably you're worried about civil war in the United States. I have videos about this, a 2-series video a couple years back now. Something about, if you just Google Mo Freedom Foundation Civil War, it should come up. And yeah, I've got 2 series. Basically, like, people argue that, things are worse now than they've ever been. We're super divided, yada, yada. And that's just bullshit. There are multiple periods in U.S. history where we're more divided. Obviously, the 1850s that led to a real civil war, but the 1960s in particular, and I talk about that. I think, I've got a video called 4 Dead in Ohio, where I actually talk about the 1960s and just how much worse it was than where we are today. We've got a lot of people being really mean to each other on Twitter, and mass shootings are awful, especially politically motivated ones. But I mean, we had the centers of most American cities burning down in the 1960s. We had, it was so much worse back then. I think this idea that we're heading towards a civil war is just people not knowing history, and just being wimps, basically. Fucking suck it up. It's been worse before. We'll survive this too. No, the United States is not heading towards a civil war. Gras asks, hey, do you think Bernie would win? I think so, honestly. I don't like Bernie because he's too fucking old. I just think it's really horrifying that, the idea of a septuagenarian president at this point just pisses me off. So I'm not a Bernie supporter, but do I think Bernie would win against Donald Trump? Honestly, at this point, yes. Yes, I do think he would. I think he would win. But I do wonder if that's a little riskier than we need to go. I don't know. But yeah, to answer simply, yes, I think Bernie could win. I think that Trump is extraordinarily unpopular, and I think the reason he sort of slipped into the presidency last time was people really hated Hillary Clinton, and people don't hate Bernie. Even people who strongly disagree with Bernie's ideology think he's an honest guy, want to grab a beer with him. So yeah, I don't think that's how that works. Or rather, I think Bernie would absolutely beat Trump. and might have beat him in 2016 too. Okay. Do we have questions? Questions. Oh, someone's singing the My Little Pony theme, which is interesting. Well, that's interesting. Oh, nice. Adrian Pumelzak has got some real hate going on here. That's interesting. Hail Hydra, wow. All right, we've got a lot of anybody asking questions here. Do you think DSM 0305 asks, do you think African countries need to create a bloc, something along the line of the EU, to prosper without getting used by bigger powers like China and the US? Yes, well, the African countries have a bloc. It's called the African Union. But I think, as DSM knows, DSM 0305 knows, it is yet to really come to fruition. The African Union, unfortunately or fortunately, I mean, it's actually, my understanding is that the African Union's had some really positive influence in the Sudan issue. They've been very much on the side of the protesters and have helped get things to the status where they are, where hopefully there's an agreement between the protesters and the regime. We'll see how that goes. But the African Union exists, does positive things, is not yet as powerful as I would like it to be. I think that there's a lot. I think the African Union did the African Union propose a unified currency, which after the experience of Europe and the euro, I can't imagine why anybody would want to do that. What I think they absolutely should do in Africa, and I think would provide a tremendous boost to the African economy, the world economy, and yes, make them more resilient against Chinese and Western imperialism, is sort of a free trade area. I think that's absolutely something that should be done in Africa. It's fascinating. I guess was I getting this from a Visual Politic video? That's another YouTube, politically faced YouTube channel, Visual Politic. And they had pointed out, which kind of blew my mind, that individual African countries tend to have more trade with China or the United States or Europe than they have with the countries next door. That's insane to me. I mean, like, the United States' largest trading partners, I believe, are Canada and Mexico. And in Europe, every European country, their largest trading partners, or at least their larger trading partners are, whoever's on, whoever they have borders with. That makes sense. That's sort of how economic activity should work. In Africa, that's not the case. There's not a lot of inter-African trade. There's some, of course, and it's growing massively, but it's growing massively from a really low base. And I think if Africa is ever to be sort of truly independent, it is truly independent. Not West Africa, but it is certainly much more independent than it ever has been. But to get to higher levels of independence, economic independence, true power, and the ability to exert themselves on the world stage, African countries need to do more sort of trade unification. They just need to trade with each other more. Who knows? It'll be a century before they're trading more with each other than they are with China and the United States, but it could be a century, depending on the country. But they should be looking to trade more with each other, because that will make them more powerful, more impervious to imperialist bullshit. So there's that question. Alex Cross asks, "Are you gay?" No, I am not. Not my understanding. Bartos Jornada asks, "Do you think that Hernandez will stay in power in Honduras?" I was just reading about this. I don't know enough about it. I gotta think that I've not read anything good about like what this insane interaction with Donald Trump and the folks in the border has got to have done to politics in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. It's just, I need to read more. I do speak Spanish, so I should probably read I should read some Honduran papers, some El Salvadoran papers. But yeah, can't speak enough to Hernandez in Honduras. I do know that Honduras is a desperately poor country. I visited, I mean, gosh, 20 years ago, so I'm sure it's a completely different country now, but it was a tremendously, sort of as a spoiled teenager from the New York City suburbs, it was a real smack in the face, seeing real poverty for the first time in Honduras. And I hope things get better there. Agent Libre asks, what do you think of Peter Thiel? Have you seen his speech on National Conservatism YouTube channel? What do I think of Peter Thiel? I don't think of Peter Thiel much. I think he, is kind of an interesting guy, supports a couple libertarian causes that aren't the worst. My understanding is that he sort of used U.S. slander and libel laws to destroy a media organization, which I think is pretty disgusting. He's a big Trump supporter, which is pretty disgusting. The whole national conservatism thing is, I think is kind of an attempt to put lipstick on the pig of Trumpism. And I think there's been a lot of noise about that. I think it's probably going to fade away. I think it's pretty silly. But I could be wrong about that. Who knows? Now, a lot of people worried about this movement, national conservatism, because I think what most people recognize, I recognize, that the incredible blessing of Donald Trump is that he's a fucking idiot. He's utterly incapable. He played a competent businessman on TV, and he's not. He's just a moron. And sort of January 2017, with people like Jeff Sessions, Steve Bannon, it really looked like we were going to get some competent, fascists, running the country. And thankfully, Donald Trump is just an idiot and can't really do anything or think any further than, his Twitter feed. And it's been a fiasco. So the great fear is that there will be, a smart Trump one day, someone who's actually capable of doing anything, might know a thing or two about how the government works. And sort of national conservatism is the sort of ideology that's supposed to produce that. I think they're obsessing over, I've seen a lot of people on Twitter obsessing over Josh Hawley out of some M state. He's a senator who likes preaching about elites, despite the fact that he, went to Harvard or Yale or something. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a lot of people are a little too obsessed about something without actually much demonstration that it has any legs after Trump. I still firmly believe that Donald Trump has kind of destroyed the Republican Party, and it's going to spend 4 to 8 years desperately trying to rebuild itself. And I think its future is probably actually finding non-white standard bearers like Nikki Haley. I don't think it's, the people to pick up the pieces of the Republican Party after Trump are not going to be Tom Cotton and whoever this Hawley fella is. Probably going to be Nikki Haley. Questions. Do we have questions? Omar Arda Saltala says, hello to everyone. Hello. Stan Cormie asks, what do African countries export? It is at this point primarily agricultural and mineral, but there is growing manufacturing. Noah Smith, a guy I follow on Twitter, has been making a big stink lately about growing manufacturing in Africa. And that's fantastic. And it's apparently actually driven by the Chinese, who are now sick of paying Chinese wages and want to go pay African wages for manufacturing. I think it was Visual Politic, the video on Africa I watched recently was talking specifically about Rwanda's building motorcycles now. But obviously, unfortunately, folks in the developing world are probably not going to be that interested in a Rwandan motorcycle, but other people in Africa might be. So what do African countries export? Yeah, it's still primarily agricultural mineral, but growing and developing rapidly. Henry Hein Lin Hitet asks, how much did neoliberal policies contribute to the rise of far-right political parties and movements in Europe? Oh man, I don't know. What does neoliberal mean? I've got a video called What is Neoliberalism? honestly, the main contributor to the rise of far-right political parties and movements in Europe is U.S. and British policy in Syria and NATO policy in Libya. I think the far-right political parties, yes, I absolutely think there's something to the critique that these far-right political parties came out of generations of lefty, bureaucratic, democratic deficit EU government for sure. But the reason they, got their massive push was because the Obama administration decided to destroy Libya and Syria and create a massive refugee movement. That's the main thing. I think it's absolutely true, and I hope, when I have the time, I bought a Yanis Varoufakis book, and I'll try and find some right-wing stuff too. I want to dive in on how the EU fucked up, and I agree that the EU definitely fucked up. And I think Varoufakis, the old Greek finance minister, would definitely be on the idea that neoliberal policies contributed to that. If someone could recommend a good sort of more right-leaning critique of the EU, I definitely want to read that as well. But the main reason the far-right political parties went nuts is because the Obama administration decided to destroy Syria and Libya. That's what, if the EU dies, that's what killed it, U.S. policy. So there's that. That's interesting. Trying to beat PewDiePie without vids. Says More Freedom Foundation. Do you think there is going to be war between the U.S. and Iran? What are the probabilities? Do you think Russia would back Iran in such a conflict? I have no good answer to the first two questions. I think a war between U.S. and Iran would be incredibly stupid. I think millions would die. Thousands of Americans and millions of people in Iraq, Syria, and Iran. I think it'd be horrific. I think it'd be an incredible crime. I think the United States, whether it won or lost, would lose eventually, obviously. What are the probabilities? I don't know. We're really in this horrific place where we're reliant on a bunch of mercurial assholes. It depends on Trump. It depends on John Bolton. It depends on Mike Pompeo. It depends on individual soldiers and members of the Iranian and American military forces in the Strait of Hormuz and what they do and do not do and do not screw up. I don't know. War between U.S. and Iran is very possible, and it would be very bad. It could also never happen. Don't know. Do you think Russia would back Iran in such a conflict? Absolutely not. I think that Russia would be, it would make go overboard to say delighted if the U.S. were to get into a war with Iran, but they'd probably condemn it. They'd, say bad things. Who knows? Maybe they'd support Iran in like really roundabout ways. But would Russia jump in to defend Iran? Fuck no. Because if the Strait of Hormuz gets blocked, all of Putin's problems are instantly solved. He becomes one of the, in the United States, all of Texas's problems instantly get solved as well. That's actually a really terrifying thing to think about, is especially we've got a stock market crash, trade war might actually succeed in bringing about a worldwide economic downturn. That happens, oil price goes into the toilet, and a lot of people in Texas start wanting a war with Iran a lot harder. And people in Texas do have a lot of influence with Republican administrations. So if you add the war with Iran party gets, it's already got all the Saudi lobbyists, it's already got all the Israeli lobbyists, all the Texas oil lobbyists jump on there as well, then yeah, war with Iran gets a lot more probable. But to go back to the Russia question, so a war between U.S. and Iran that shuts down the Strait of Hormuz and oil production is pure profit for Russia. That'd be fantastic for them, both in the very short term. The oil and gas that they sell the prices for that will go through the roof. It will be fantastic for Russia and for Texas. But also in the long term, it's a war that the U.S. Win or lose is guaranteed to lose long term. It's just another. With Iraq, there was a coalition of the willing. There was nobody thought Saddam Hussein was a good guy. Nobody thinks the Iranian mullahs today are good guys, but nobody thinks that they're the reason this war would happen either. If war between the U.S. and Iran happens, nobody outside of the New York Times, CNN, Fox News will pretend that anybody is more at fault than the United States. So Russia won't fight for Iran. They will profit off of that war. But it'll be an incredible propaganda victory for Russia because it will be proof of what they've been saying for years, that the United States is this insane, aggressive power that never stopped fighting the Cold War. Okay. DSM0305 asks, do you think African and Asian countries need more natural borders? And do you think the Western imposed borders have a thing to say in the chaos that may reside in these countries? I think that we need absolutely no changes to borders. I think changes to borders are bad. I think there's a lot to be said for the status quo, and a lot of these Western imposed borders absolutely have been hellishly bad, really, really bad thing. But basically you start over again from zero if you make new borders. In some cases, maybe it's got to happen. But the history of it isn't very good. Look at South Sudan is the most recent example of like, okay, let's redo these Western imposed borders in a better way. And maybe it'll eventually be better, but the war that South Sudan fell into is pretty horrific. And it just seems to be a continuation of their endless independence war. So yeah, I think I always lean towards keeping the imposed borders because those borders have now been the case for 70 years. One of my greatest fuck ups on this channel, and something that I regret and I need to sort of do corrections for, was that at the height of the Islamic State thing back in 2014, I think I ran a couple videos that were like, yeah, maybe it's time to split up Iraq. And that's not what the Iraqis want, because even though Iraq was a ridiculously arbitrary thing thrown together by the British in the 20s, it's existed for a century. And there's real weight and power behind the idea of being an Iraqi. So maybe in some cases, some few cases, it would be useful, like, Czechoslovakia, peacefully broke up into Slovakia and the Czech Republic. Like maybe, but I think there are very few examples of where that might be good. And even where it seemed like it might be good, like South Sudan, it seems to have turned out to be not awesome. So yeah, that's what questions I have to say about that. Do we have questions? Can climate change make Russia, Fatel Guerra asks, can climate change make Russia a superpower again? I would say no, I don't think so. This is actually a really interesting idea because I've got a video when I finally put out my Avoiding the British Empire video series talking about Halford Mackinder and this idea of the Eurasian world island and the coming Russian superpower because they connect Europe and Asia and they've got this massive lands and agricultural and mineral wealth. I think that a lot of those ideas come out of the 19th century where the United States developed a massive interior with a whole bunch of immigrants that just wanted to set up their own farms. That population doesn't exist anymore. Actually, a lot of people are rampaging to immigrate to Russia, but they're rampaging to immigrate to Russia to work in Moscow and St. Petersburg, not to go out and build new megacities in the middle of nowhere. So I guess the idea between climate change making Russia a superpower again would be, Siberia all of a sudden becomes a lovely place to be. We can barely get people to move to the US Midwest, and there's, many big cities where you can build very affordable, nice lives there. Russia's got, there's some cities in Siberia. But yeah, no, I don't think, I think this vast swaths of agricultural land era where you could, this weird technological era where you could move millions of people who wanted to go build their own farms to places quickly. I think that was a 19th century phenomenon that's kind of over. So no, I don't think climate change will make Russia a superpower again. Somebody said, a futurist I read, his book says a war with Russia will happen soon. The only way a war with Russia would happen between the United States would be if it was Russia and China teaming up against the United States. And I really don't think Russia's stupid enough to do that, because then they just become a Chinese satellite. Palou Saloneman asks, do you think the Democratic Party has gone irrevocably to the left, and can it reform if it has? No, I don't think the Democratic Party has gone irrevocably to the left. I think that's clearly the Fox News selling point for the next election, because they certainly don't have anything to sell with fucking Trump. I think there are certain left-wing ideas that are worth pursuing. I think it's time for universal health care in the United States. I think there are certain figures in the Democratic Party, like Ocasio-Cortez most famously, and Sanders, and who are pushing a whole bunch of ideas that are just silly and aren't going to happen, like the Green New Deal, and the college guarantee, and the job guarantee, and all that hogwash. And Fox News is certainly really invested in saying these people have taken over the party. But if you actually pay attention to the people who run and are the politicians of the Democratic Party, it's very obviously not true. Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Pressley, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. These are all figures who come from very left-oriented urban environments. It's shocking that these districts didn't already have super left leaders. And honestly, in the case of Ayanna Pressley, I don't think she isn't dramatically more left-wing than the old Italian guy she replaced. It's just reflecting that, urban, whatever her district is now more conventionally minority than it is Italian. I don't think the Democratic Party has really moved left in a particularly shocking way. I think on certain issues, yes, like we have moved left because like the country has moved left, and people are aware that like, oh wait, shit, like I guess just doing free trade agreements and deregulating business has had a lot of amazing effects, a lot of really positive effects. But now it's probably time to switch back a little bit. I think that's just common sense. There should probably be a little more dividing up the pie. But this idea that the Democrats are a bunch of fucking crazy socialists is just, sort of stupid ideology from a bankrupt party. Questions? Stan Cormie asks, was South Africa better off with apartheid? No, it was not. Because apartheid is evil and fucking stupid. It's just these absolutely insane. Like Zimbabwe is a great example. Like they're like, Zimbabwe used to be the fucking breadbasket of the world, and now it can't feed itself. And yeah, okay, that's fucking true. But when Zimbabwe was the breadbasket of the world, it was because white men with guns came in and forced the people who had always lived there to work essentially, in a quasi-slavery. Now, it wasn't slavery, no, because, the British Empire was against slavery. So it wasn't slavery. The Africans who lived there just weren't allowed to do anything other than agricultural labor, were only allowed to own certain kinds of land, had to do this. So yeah, it's this classic, it's like the Caribbean, the Caribbean actually was so much more profitable. Like, did you know that in the 1700s, the Caribbean was tremendously profitable, was one of the richest regions in the world, like the Shanghai, the New York City, the London, the Paris, all wrapped in together. That was what was going on in the Caribbean islands. And these cities were some of the richest places in the world. France and Britain were like, their empires were dependent on the money that they got from the Caribbean. Why don't we go back to back then, all we'd have to do would be to enslave everybody in the Caribbean, because that's, yeah. So like this idea that like, on certain metrics of, the economy or organization, like, yeah, maybe Zimbabwe or South Africa sort of produced more, did more, but it was under fundamentally evil fucking systems. And gee whiz, has the first 30 years under of recovery from that fundamentally evil system not been all fired fucking awesome? Well, oh well. We're getting better as a world. Yeah, this whole like, oh, South Africa's better under apartheid thing is basically people who are, thought that uh, Georgia was better under slavery. And yeah, that's actually kind of interesting. Like you now finally have places like Georgia, the Carolinas, one of the great, over the past 20, 30 years, one of the great success stories in the United States has been some of these old South states, Georgia, the Carolinas specifically. Um, so was the complete uprooting of its slave-based approach to the economy a bad thing for Georgia and the Carolinas circa the 1870s, 1880s? Well, yeah, sure, I guess. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't great for the Georgians and the North Carolinian, rich people that, they couldn't force people to work on their plantations anymore. And yeah, for almost a century, actually, yeah, you can argue more than a century, Mississippi's case, the Old South became an economic backwater where people just left in droves. Um, uh, that's what happens when you base your economy on an evil system and then it ends. So yeah, on some metrics, maybe South Africa or Zimbabwe were better off. It took a century for Georgia and the Carolinas to find a better way of a successful way to organize themselves post their evil systems. Maybe it'll take South Africa and Zimbabwe a century to find a better way to organize themselves after their evil systems. So yeah, I get really fucking pissed off when people come at me with this, like, "Ooh, South Africa was better under apartheid." Yeah, it was better under apartheid for a couple white people, and maybe people in the U.S. and Britain that own shares in whatever fucking companies were profiting off of South Africa and Zimbabwe back then. So yeah, I have no sympathy for that logic. Thanks, though. Um, Avesta Zainel asks, I too would like to know if you think war between Iran and the U.S. is likely, and if Russia would back Iran in such a conflict. I answered that question. Yeah. So, um, okay. Where's the question here? Question. Okay, Local Extreme asks, why is Florida so stubbornly Republican despite large cities and a large Hispanic population? Because Florida is filled with old people. It's quite straightforward. Traditionally, Florida was a little more democratic because uh, it was generally the old people that lived in Florida were generally a little wealthier and sort of nice. It used to be, more wealthy Americans that could afford to have a second home down south or to retire down south. But that's continued to shift, which is a good thing. You've now got a lot of people from the, sort of old white people from the Midwest who are moving down to Florida. There's some famous, I think it's called The Villages, is a famously pro-Trump retirement community that's built in the past 10, 15 years of just like something like 50,000 people. It's insane. And it's one of many. So the Florida population has been, I think its growth rate might be even higher than California and Texas, but that growth has been old people moving there. It's also a tremendous tax haven. It's one of the, I think Texas is this way as well, but yeah, Florida has no state taxes or no state income taxes or something along those lines. So yeah, Florida's population growth is driven by old white retired people, which is why it's so stubbornly Republican. Questions. Oh wait, did I see a super chat up there? Yes. Can you answer Logocool's question about the EU? I can definitely do that if I can find it. I did the. Okay. Logocool Extreme asks two questions. Is German fear of debt holding back the European Union from competing with the United States and China? I would say yes, absolutely. I think that is something that is happening. Trying to write a script on it right now and failing, mostly because I don't fucking believe a lot of things that people say about the economy. And why is Europe in a downward spiral? I think downward spiral is a little excessive. I'd say serious stagnation. Why is Europe so stagnant? And I think, yeah, I think there's many reasons why Germany is so stagnant. It's sort of missed out on the IT boom. That's kind of an important thing that it didn't do, that it wasn't really a part of. And I think there are elements of this sort of central market that, there's a lot of different critiques. There's sort of the right-wing critique that's like, oh, their labor markets are shitty, which I think there's probably some truth to. I mean, there's a high degree of protections, and actually, that's not necessary for workers, and that's not a bad thing. It's just when you're competing against the US, where we don't have any of those protections, and China, where they have no protections, you're obviously not going to do as well. Not as friendly for entrepreneurs. European business is famously sort of run by a lot of people by sort of classes of people who've run European business for centuries, and it's a little stagnant. And yeah, I think the German fear of debt is holding back the European Union. The monetary union was a disaster. Countries need different monetary solutions. They need to manage their currencies differently to get certain results. And the European Union, for almost 20 years now, has been operating under the euro. And what Germany needs to make the German economy work better. That is not what the Italian economy needs to make the Italian economy work better. So that's a real problem. There's just a ton of problems that have contributed to this. But one possible solution would be for the Germans to spend more money. And I think that is what the Germans are not willing to do. So I don't think it's just, you can't just blame the German fear of debt. There are many contributions, like, the fucking refugee crisis the United States created. So there are many problems in Europe, but the Germans are not stepping up, I think. And I think that's sort of the message of this video that I have to finally write. The Germans are not stepping up in the leadership role that they absolutely have in Europe. So that's the main problem. And yeah, their budget is an aspect of that. So that is why Europe is stagnating. I don't think the Germans are leading to the extent that they should. Okay, I think I answered the EU question. Okay, I answered the EU question. Gorkum Ozjan says, question, I feel as if people have figured out how to be dictators in democratic systems without having to change the system. Any comments? It's interesting. I think I disagree with this sort of pessimism. I mean, I'm going to assume you're talking about Erdogan here, or Bolsonaro, or Putin. I think that dictators have always figured out how to be dictators in democratic systems. I don't think it's a particularly new development. Also, I don't think they're as powerful as past sort of democratic dictators have been. Actually, no, I don't know. Maybe it is a newer development, but one of the reasons why it seems like there's a new development of these democratic dictators is that so many more places are operating under representative systems. So no representative system is perfect, least of all the United States, or even Switzerland, or Switzerland might be, I don't know. Switzerland or Scandinavia, they've got massive problems too. They've got problems of representation. It's always a constant battle, maintaining, preserving, expanding a democratic or representative set of institutions, always. And I don't think it's particularly surprising that some countries that are sort of newer to the idea of representative institutions, like Russia or Turkey, fall back on that a bit. But there's also elements, less in Russia, but in Turkey that are, tremendously hopeful. So I think it's part of the constant sort of conversation. Yeah. So I'm not as, I think it's true that, folks like Erdogan or Putin have figured out how to be, dictatorial or Orban, dictatorial in democratic systems, Orban of Hungary. But I don't think it's necessarily something to be as terrified of. I think I did a video on this, sort of like democracy is not dying. Maybe, last year. I think talks specifically about this a lot more. Let's see here. John Walkers asks, do you expect to see nuclear war in your lifetime? Yikes. No, I do not expect to see it. I think it's very possible. Anything's possible. I think nuclear war is always a lot more possible than we think it is, because we don't really want to wrap our head around how possible it is. What I am actually honestly surprised I haven't seen is some kind of nuclear terrorism, some kind of dirty bomb. That I think is almost inevitable in my lifetime. But, we've made it through probably a quarter of my lifetime, since 9/11. Jesus, that's depressing. Without nuclear terrorism. So who knows? We could do that 2 more times. Nuclear war is, if we can be more sensible about non-proliferation, like actually stick to non-proliferation deals we make, like the JCPOA with Iran. I think it's possible that, we won't see nuclear war for hundreds of years. It's possible. I don't know if it's likely, but it's possible. So yeah, I don't know. Error Zero asks, do you think there is any action this administration could commit that would cause Canada, UK, and or Mexico to fully sever ties with the US? Yes, of course it's possible, but very, very, very unlikely. Those countries listed there are tremendously dependent on the United States. So to fully sever ties with the United States, like, it's just, even if Trump went full fascist, and Canada and Mexico would try to find a way to deal with this. Because they'd have to. They don't have a choice. So fully sever ties with the U.S. No, I don't think so. The U.K. Like, could I imagine the U.S. fucking up badly enough that the entire EU and the rest of the world turns against the EU teams up with China? We've already seen elements of that with like Instex and the reaction to throwing out the JCPOA. But I think what you're talking about is something more serious, like fully sever ties with the US. No, like create a EU, Russia, China axis against the US. It would take decades. I think at the very beginning, of the Trump administration, I did a video sort of talking about the U.S. is still so powerful that the Trump really has wide latitude to be just a complete asshole. The problem is, 15, 20 years from now, where because of Trump's actions, and also just because it was going to happen anyway, the U.S. isn't as much more powerful than everybody else as it was, then that's when we'll truly suffer the consequences of Trump's fuck-ups, is decades in the future. But no, I don't think anything that Trump could do right now would result in, right now, severing of ties. Okay. Oh, shit. DSM-0305, do you think EU needs to expand further or hold with expansion? I think that the EU needs to get back to real economic growth before it expands any further. I would like to see Russia in the EU eventually. I would like to see Turkey in the EU eventually. But none of that's possible before, the EU can put up some serious economic growth numbers. So the EU has a lot to figure out before. I mean, it's a limping victim at this point, and adding Russia or Turkey at this point just doesn't make a ton of sense. So eventually, yes, I would love the EU to expand to Russia, expand to Europe, the Middle East, around the Mediterranean. But that's not what's happening this decade or the next. Thought on Bernie Sanders hammering the point about being the son of a Holocaust survivor to fight Trump's rhetoric. I think that's fine. I don't don't really have any thoughts on that. Generally, I think that the memory of the Holocaust can be used to protect Israel a bit too much. But if Bernie Sanders wants to bring up the Holocaust to talk about racism in general, and his own personal biography, more power to him, I guess. Robert Fried says, I predict that there is going to be a huge increase in racial balkanization of the U.S. We may see the formation of 3 nations, 1 black, 1 Latino, 1 black. Robert Fried, that's absolutely ridiculous. I think that's one of the stupidest things I've ever heard, quite frankly. Sorry to be so negative, but yeah, I think it's ridiculous. There's this guy, Victor Davis Hanson, who is a well-respected, not an alt-right figure. He goes on Fox News. My father's a big fan of his, who has famously published this series. I think he wrote a book, and he's always done these articles about Mexifornia, about how California was slowly turning into this Mexican fifth column, and the Mexicans are everywhere, and they don't follow our laws, and they don't speak a language, and it's terrible, and Mexifornia is coming, and it's terrible. It's going to happen. So I've been reading this for years. He's been writing this for years, and is a very big part of what I used to read a lot when I was more conventionally right wing. So I went and spent 6 months in Southern California. This is the epicenter of Mexifornia. To go experience this, and yeah, I spent a lot of time. I was mostly hanging out with U.S. military people in San Diego, but and I spent a lot of time in sort of a bubble. The military people I was hanging out with were officers living in very nice neighborhoods. But also I spent a lot of time in Amtrak depots and AA meetings, and I met a lot of people who sort of look like they don't look conventionally white or American, but they all speak like they come from, the very white Chicago suburbs. This Mexifornia thing is a myth. In Hanson's defense, he's more talking about the rural areas. I mean, he's like sort of a farmer, and yeah, there's tons because of a lot of very rich agricultural business people who tend to vote Republican. Rural California can feel swamped by low-income laborers from Mexico. But you know what? Nobody fucking lives in the rural areas anymore. I mean, I'm sorry, respect to those people who are trying to make, small farming work in the 21st century. But it's a dying battle. The vast majority of the people in this country live in cities that's only going up. And what happens in the cities is a lot more important than, the insecurities of, some people out in the hinterland, which are also going to fade away because, those folks are going to most probably be 30 years from now. Those low-income laborers, if they're not robots, are most likely going to be African, actually, not Latino, like African, not African American. Like recent imports, because it's only Africa that's going to be replacing itself 20 years from now. I mean, according to projections, that may not be true, but it seems likely. So yeah, I find this idea that we're going to split into balkanization is just fucking stupid. It's not backed up by anything in U.S. history. It is backed up by things in European history, and yeah, I think it's a very sort of dumb European idea. that isn't American. So yeah, no, not going to happen. Siobhan Chene says, Brexit, please your views. Brexit, I did a whole series on Brexit before it happened, very much against it. At this point, it seems very likely that it's going to happen. I think the projections of, instant, no deal Brexit catastrophe are probably not true. I think that no deal Brexit could happen. I think, we can handle all those details. I think it can happen. But I think what will happen is if Brexit happens, which I still think is probably the more likely result, is a slow decline of Britain. The United Kingdom is already tremendously reliant on finance, and despite what people love to say, it's already slipping away. I have friends who work in London finance, many friends who work in London finance, and they will tell me that and it's not a big boom. It's not like immediately, Goldman Sachs is like, fuck it, we're moving to Frankfurt. But it's going to be a slow attrition that's already happening. Just like, oh, should we have this deal centered in the London office? Oh, let's center it in the Frankfurt office. After the next financial crisis, a whole bunch of stuff will contract in London, New York, Singapore, and everywhere. And then in the recovery, New York will come back, and Singapore will come back, and Hong Kong will come. Hong Kong will probably come back, and London won't. So yeah, I don't think there's going to be a no deal Brexit catastrophe if it happens, but I think there is going to be a slow diminishing of UK power and prestige. I don't think they really. I think they're putting a little too much faith in the United States, especially the Trump administration, in being their sort of salvation after crashing out of the EU. I just don't think that's how it's going to happen. I also think that there's a very real possibility that that Brexit will lead to the end of the United Kingdom. I think Scotland might go its own way. I think Northern Ireland might finally go its own way. So yeah. Questions? Siobhan Chene asks, why does the EU not already have united armed forces or at least paramilitary? Because the United States doesn't want it to happen, and because the EU is largely vassals of the United States. Germany, I think, is doing some cooperation between other Eastern European countries. I remember reading about that. And there's perpetually some kind of European defense force that's about to happen. And that's been true for 20 years. But, the EU has NATO, and NATO is fundamentally about selling US and to a lesser extent British and French weapons. The US and the British and the French don't really want to upset that apple cart with a real independent EU military force. So that's why it doesn't happen. Foxy Bay, that's a great name. Do you see a reemergence of secularism in Turkey close to Mustafa Kemal Ataturk rather than recent conservatism? Will urbanization help? Yes, absolutely. I have a video called Why I'm Optimistic About Turkey. There's a Why I'm Still Optimistic About Turkey that lays out exactly that argument. I think that Erdogan has been useful in one sense, in that he has, this tremendous subterranean urge for more respect for Islam and more respect for Islamic approaches in Turkish life has been brought to the fore by Erdogan, and it's sort of I don't want to seem so negative as to call it a pathology, but it's sort of an aspect or it's a poison that's been worked out. I think there's nobody in Turkey right now who can be like, Islam. I mean, some, but Muslims are being disrespected in Turkey. That's no longer the case, and I think that Turks right now certainly are a lot more interested in economic progress, and I think they're beginning to see how Erdogan is not helping that progress anymore after being an incredible help to it for a very long time. So I think this swing towards respect for Islam in Turkey has gone about as far as it's going to get, and I think things are probably going to lean a little more secular for the duration, for the future. Pelou Solomon asks, do you think that Brexit will trigger a revival of the Commonwealth? No, No, I don't. I think that the British are really overemphasizing the amount of goodwill that exists for what they did. I don't think there is much. Also, I think that the idea of the Commonwealth, the idea that was made it powerful, was that there would be sort of a free trade area of the Commonwealth or what have you. And I mean, who knows what the WTO will look like in about 30 years, but I don't think you can really do the Commonwealth to the extent that you would have been able to before the WTO, under the WTO. Like, I think the World Trade Organization does the things that the Commonwealth was supposed to do and doesn't exclude people. So yeah, no, I don't think the Commonwealth has much future. Questions. Thoughts on Balkan economic growth? Wow, that's a great question. I have no thoughts. This is from Fatal Gueda. I have no thoughts on Balkan economic growth, and I'm embarrassed. The Balkans are a fascinating area. I think that they're definitely suffering because the Balkans are not, it's sort of a dependent region. They're dependent on two supposedly great economic engines, the European Union and Turkey. The Balkan region is sort of in between the two. And the Balkans did very well out of Turkey's and the EU's economic boost. The EU ending in 2009 and Turkey sort of ending in 2013, 14, 15. Unfortunately, I think Balkan economic growth is pretty dependent on what happens in the European Union more broadly and what happens in Turkey. And neither of those things are doing all that hot right now. Daniel Urick says, I find it strange that people who say it's not about race, but about Western culture. In my opinion, Latin America is part of Western culture. And I say, exactly. I agree with you completely on that. And I think I mentioned it earlier. This idea that Mexicans are not part of Western culture is fucking idiotic. Anyway, sorry. Your thoughts on the Great Emu War? Damn it, somebody told me. Siobhan Chene asked your thoughts on the Great Emu War. Is that an Australia thing? Someone was just telling me about that, and honestly, nothing really stuck. Look out for emus. They're very powerful beasts. All right. Well, if we've gotten to the Great Emu War, we're probably coming to the end of useful questions, and we are almost at 2 hours. That just breezed right by. So I would like to thank all of you for showing up. John Lockers asks, what do you think about a Pan-American Union? Oh man, I could talk about that for like half an hour. I love the idea of a Pan-American Union. I love the idea of first sort of customs union or sort of free, more sort of a NAFTA that expands across the Americas. I think that'd be amazing. Do that for like 30, 40 years, and then we can do free movement, after that. And then, maybe 100 years after that, we could do a unified currency. Those are my brief thoughts about a Pan-American Union. Yeah, I don't know. I like the idea. Anyway, I think it's probably time to close up. I want to thank all y'all for showing up. My name is Robert Morris. I essentially am the Mo Freedom Foundation. Of course, it's also all of you. You guys make this possible through your contributions on PayPal and Patreon, and also just by showing up, commenting, chatting, interacting with what we do here. None of it would be possible without you guys. And I'm very grateful. You can find me on Instagram at The Golden Age. You can find me on Twitter at RoboLaw. My website, www.morefreedomfoundation, is, well, I'm having trouble with it, but it still exists, and you can find a lot of my stuff there. I have a book called Everybody's Lying About Islam that has been out for a number of years now. I'd suggest checking that out if you have any questions about the U.S.-Saudi relationship, terrorism, or the waste of time of the past 20 years of the war on terror. And hopefully, at some point in September, It's out with the editor now, but have completed a new book called Avoiding the British Empire, which talks about mostly tells the story of the British Empire, a story that surprisingly few people know, and talks about the lessons that the people in Washington, D.C. should have taken from the rise and fall of the British Empire, sort of laying some of those out and trying to put together a sort of hopeful vision of the future. That's Avoiding the British Empire. That should be out in September. I hope you'll check that out. And yeah, thanks. I'm really grateful to all you folks for being here, and you're the best. Thanks.